Berlin airspace, early morning, March 1944. The air above Germany was frozen steel. Thin winter light crept through the clouds as distant rumbling filled the horizon. Radar operators at Luftwaffe command stations traced hundreds of tiny dots moving east to west. Another American raid. The biggest yet. Engines roared to life at Luftwaffe airfields from Hanover to Magdeburg. Ground crews rushed, loading ammunition belts into Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Pilots climbed into cockpits, tightening their harnesses. For months, these men had watched American bombers turn back or fall burning before ever reaching Berlin. Today, they expected the same. But as the German fighters clawed upward through the freezing mist, something unexpected appeared, dark shapes glinting silver in the morning sun. Sleek, fast, climbing higher than anything they had ever seen. The radio crackled with disbelief. "These aren't thunderbolts," one voice gasped. "They're still with the bombers." At that moment, the Luftwaffe realized the impossible had happened. The Americans had finally found a way to bring their fighters all the way to Berlin. And in the sky that day, the balance of the air war began to shift forever. Europe, 1942 to 1943. Before the Mustang came, the skies over Germany were a graveyard. When the United States joined the war in late 1941, its leaders promised to strike the heart of Nazi industry. The strategy was simple on paper: crush the enemy's factories, railways, and oil refineries through daylight precision bombing. But the reality was far from simple. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, launched waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators across the Channel. The bombers carried the pride of American technology: self-sealing fuel tanks, multiple gun turrets, and the confidence that tight formations could defend themselves against enemy fighters. They called it the combat box. At first, the plan seemed to work. Small raids hit targets in France and the Low Countries with moderate losses. But by 1943, as the Allies pressed deeper into occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe adapted. German radar networks detected incoming raids hours in advance. Fighter groups scrambled in coordinated waves, intercepting bombers long before they reached their targets. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s attacked head-on, exploiting the blind spots in the bomber formations. The sky became a slaughterhouse. On August 17, 1943, 376 B-17s left England in twin missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg, key centers for Germany's aircraft production. They met a wall of fire. German fighters swarmed in relentless waves. Bombers burned one after another, scattering crews across the fields of Bavaria. Of the aircraft that left England that morning, more than 60 never returned. The losses were devastating. Hundreds of young airmen vanished in a single day. For the crews who survived, the statistics were brutal. By late 1943, the odds of completing a 25-mission tour were almost nil. Still, the generals in England pressed on. Precision bombing, they argued, would break Germany's industrial backbone, if only they could reach the targets. But reaching them meant flying deeper into German territory, and beyond the range of their escort fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt, America's main high-altitude fighter, could only accompany the bombers partway across France. The P-38 Lightning had the range, but struggled in Europe's freezing altitudes and tight escort formations. Each time the fighters turned back, the Luftwaffe was waiting. By the autumn of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign teetered on the edge of collapse. Losses over Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Münster forced commanders to halt deep penetration raids altogether. The dream of crippling Nazi industry from the air was slipping away. Unless, somehow, the Americans could find a fighter that could go the distance. One that could follow the bombers all the way to Berlin, fight, and bring its pilot home. And in the shadows of British airfields, that miracle was already taking shape. Britain and the U.S., 1940 to 1944. The aircraft that would one day shatter Germany's air defenses didn't begin as an American idea at all. In 1940, before the U.S. had even entered the war, Britain's Royal Air Force desperately needed more fighters. Their factories were stretched thin, producing Hurricanes and Spitfires, and the Luftwaffe still loomed across the Channel. So the British Purchasing Commission turned to North American Aviation with an urgent request: build more P-40 Warhawks. Fast. But North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmid, had another idea. Rather than license an outdated plane, he proposed building something new from scratch. A sleeker, faster fighter optimized for high-speed performance and long range. In just 117 days, his team produced the prototype NA-73X. The result was revolutionary: a low-drag laminar flow wing, streamlined fuselage, and efficient cooling system that reduced drag even further. The British named it the Mustang. The first models, the Mustang MKI, were fitted with Allison engines. At low altitudes, they were fast, agile, and perfect for ground attack. But above 15,000 feet, the power dropped sharply. They were good, not great. Not yet. Then came a turning point. In 1942, British engineers at Rolls-Royce decided to experiment, replacing the Allison engine with their legendary Merlin 61, the same power plant used in the Spitfire Mk9. The transformation was instant. The new Mustang could climb higher, fly faster, and maintain power deep into the stratosphere. When American engineers at Packard began producing the Merlin under license, the P-51B Mustang was born, and with it, a new era of air warfare. The timing could not have been more critical. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was bleeding aircraft. Every deep strike seemed suicidal. The Luftwaffe's fighters still ruled the heart of Europe. But with the Merlin-powered Mustangs arriving in Britain, the Americans finally had a weapon that could escort bombers from takeoff to target and back again. It wasn't just about endurance. The P-51 was agile, heavily armed, and capable of taking the fight to the Germans on their own terms. Pilots loved it instantly. Its bubble canopy gave unmatched visibility, its aerodynamic lines cut through the cold air, and its range, nearly 1,800 miles with drop tanks, meant it could reach Berlin, fight, and still make it home. General James Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, recognized what this meant. He changed the rules. The P-51s were no longer to stay with the bombers. They were to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it hid. And so, in early 1944, as the Allies prepared for the greatest invasion in history, the Mustang began its reign over Europe's skies. The stage was set for the confrontation that would change the air war forever. The Germans were confident, the Americans determined, and the next battle would decide who ruled the heavens above Berlin. Winter 1943. Spring 1944. 1. The human angle inside the bombers. For the men inside the flying fortresses, the air war was a battle measured in hours and altitude. At 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Oxygen masks froze, engines howled, and each minute was another gamble against flak, fire, and fear. They called themselves the lucky ones. But luck was relative. Crews watched entire formations vanish in seconds. Friends turned into vapor trails and falling debris. On the ground, letters piled up at American bases in England. Wives, mothers, and sweethearts still waiting for replies that would never come. Every mission was the same ritual. Briefing before dawn. Coffee gone cold. Maps marked with red lines deep into enemy territory. Pilots knew that once the fighters turned home, they were alone. They joked to mask the dread, but every man understood the truth. Over Germany, death came with the sound of a diving engine and the flash of tracers tearing through aluminum skin. So when the first silver Mustangs appeared above them, fast, steady, and refusing to turn back, the relief was indescribable. For the first time, they had guardians who could go the distance. And the bombers flew on deeper than ever before. 2. The German perspective shock in the skies. To the Luftwaffe, air combat had always been a game of control. German fighter wings were masters of coordination, attacking in tight pairs, striking from altitude, and retreating before the enemy could react. Their aces, men like Walter Nauetny, Egon Mayer, and Adolf Galland, had grown accustomed to dominance. Until the Mustangs came. At first, German radar stations dismissed reports of American fighters deep over Germany as mistakes. No Allied plane could fly that far, not with fuel to fight. But soon, the evidence became impossible to ignore. P-51s were appearing near Leipzig, then Hanover, and finally near Berlin itself. The first encounters were brutal. Luftwaffe formations climbing to intercept bombers found themselves ambushed from above. The Mustangs didn't wait, they hunted. Using altitude, speed, and surprise, they tore through German ranks before the bombers even arrived. Pilots who once felt untouchable now found themselves outnumbered, outclimbed, and outgunned. Many German veterans described that moment as a breaking point, when they realized they no longer ruled the sky. And worse, the replacements filling their squadrons were young, undertrained, and terrified. The air war had turned. The hunter was now the hunted. 3. The technological angle, engineering a miracle. Behind the Mustang's beauty lay a perfect marriage of science and necessity. Its laminar flow wing and experimental design minimized drag at high speeds. The cooling system, shaped like a scoop beneath the fuselage, used heated air to produce extra thrust instead of slowing the plane. Every inch of its design served performance and efficiency. But it was the engine that made it immortal. The Rolls-Royce Merlin transformed the P-51 into a predator at altitude. The engine's two-stage, two-speed supercharger allowed it to breathe thin air where German fighters gasped for power. At 30,000 feet, the Mustang was still accelerating while others stalled. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns gave it bite, deadly against both fighters and ground targets. And with drop tanks slung under its wings, the Mustang's range extended deep into Germany, far beyond what any Allied aircraft had achieved before. The result was not just a new fighter, it was an entirely new kind of warfare. The Allies could now strike at the heart of the Reich and protect their bombers the entire way. For the first time, victory in the air seemed within reach. And soon, that promise would be tested in the most decisive air campaign of the war. Early 1944, the turning tide. 4. The tactical angle, changing the rules of the sky. Before the P-51, American fighters had been shackled by doctrine. Their mission was simple: stay with the bombers, protect them, never chase the enemy too far. But this defensive mindset played into German hands. Luftwaffe interceptors could dictate when and where to attack, retreat, refuel, and strike again. The bombers became slow, predictable targets, steel clouds drifting toward certain death. When the Mustang arrived, General James "Jimmy" Doolittle tore up the rulebook. He gave his fighter groups a new order: seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe, anywhere, anytime. The Mustangs didn't just escort, they hunted. Flying ahead of bomber formations, they swept enemy airfields, attacked climbing fighters, and forced the Germans into defensive chaos. Each time the Luftwaffe launched an interception, it faced Mustangs already waiting at altitude. The result was devastating. German pilots, forced to climb under heavy weight, often found themselves ambushed before reaching attack height. Losses mounted. Squadrons broke apart. Coordination crumbled. What began as a protective escort mission had turned into a strategic offensive, one that shattered the Luftwaffe's rhythm and bled it dry from the inside out. 5. The leadership angle, Doolittle's gamble. General Jimmy Doolittle was no stranger to risk. 2 years earlier, he had led the daring raid on Tokyo, a one-way mission that symbolized defiance after Pearl Harbor. Now, in 1944, he commanded the 8th Air Force at its lowest point, battered, uncertain, and demoralized. But Doolittle understood something vital about air warfare. Control of the sky isn't won by defense, it's won by destruction. His decision to unleash the Mustangs was bold, even controversial. Critics feared that abandoning bomber escort duty would expose the formations to new danger. But Doolittle saw the bigger picture. By destroying the Luftwaffe's fighters in the air and on the ground, he could protect the bombers before they were even attacked. He also pushed for aggressive pilot leadership. Squadron commanders were given freedom to hunt, improvise, and strike where the enemy was weakest. Names like George Preddy, Don Blakesley, and Clarence "Bud" Anderson became legends, fearless pilots who used the Mustang's speed and agility to dominate the skies. Under Doolittle, the 8th Air Force became not just a bomber command but a weapon of attrition. Every raid was designed to draw the Luftwaffe out and destroy it piece by piece. It was a strategy that demanded sacrifice, but it worked. 6. the moral angle, the breaking point of the Luftwaffe. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the proud, disciplined force it had once been. Its ranks were filled with young, inexperienced pilots, boys barely out of training, thrown into combat against elite American and British veterans. Fuel shortages crippled flight hours. Training programs were rushed. Experienced aces were either dead or too exhausted to continue. And each time a replacement squadron took off, they faced swarms of Mustangs already circling above. Many Luftwaffe veterans later recalled a growing sense of inevitability, a realization that no matter how skilled they were, the tide of the war had turned. They were outnumbered, outproduced, and now outflown. Morale collapsed. The once feared Jägerschwader fighter wings became shadows of their former selves. Ground crews struggled to repair aircraft that would be destroyed the next morning. Pilots stopped believing in victory. They fought only to survive the next sortie. For every German ace who fell, there were fewer men to teach the next generation. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing planes, it was losing its future. The air war over Europe had become a war of exhaustion. And in that struggle, the P-51 Mustang was relentless. Its arrival marked not just a technological shift, but a psychological one. The Germans no longer owned the daylight skies. And as spring turned to February 1944, the Allies prepared to prove it in one of the most decisive aerial offensives ever launched. Operation Argument, Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944. It began with a single word from Doolittle's headquarters at High Wycombe, go. On February 20th, 1944, more than 1,000 American bombers and 800 escort fighters roared into the pale English dawn. Their target, the beating heart of Germany's aircraft industry, Leipzig, Gotha, Brunswick, and Regensburg. The operation would last 6 days. The Allies called it Operation Argument. Pilots would later remember it by another name, Big Week. From the first moment, it was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. Radar screens across occupied Europe lit up with hundreds of blips. Sirens wailed from Denmark to Bavaria. Fighter control centers scrambled every available squadron, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, even the new Me-410 heavy fighters. By mid-morning, the sky over central Germany was alive with motion. Contrails twisting, sunlight flashing off wings, flak bursts blooming black and white against the thin winter clouds. Then the P-51s arrived. They came in fast and high, dropping through the bomber formations like wolves descending on a battlefield. German pilots, still climbing to intercept, suddenly found themselves attacked before they could even form up. Major George Preddy's 352nd Fighter Group tore through an entire wave of Fw-190s near Hanover. Captain Don Gentile, flying with the 4th Fighter Group, shot down 3 interceptors before his guns overheated. The Luftwaffe, caught off guard, struggled to regroup. Above them, the bombers pressed on. Steady, relentless, their silver fuselages glinting through bursts of flak. For the first time, they reached their targets deep inside Germany without turning back. At Augsburg, bombs shattered Messerschmitt's assembly plants. At Gotha, a sea of explosions consumed the Focke-Wulf factory. Smoke rose for miles, the Luftwaffe's lifeline burning in broad daylight. But victory came at a cost. That week, 244 American bombers and 33 fighters were lost. More than 2,500 airmen never returned. In frozen skies, parachutes bloomed like white flowers over fields of wreckage. Yet for every Mustang or Fortress that fell, 10 German aircraft went with it. By the 5th day, the Luftwaffe was reeling. Squadrons that once launched hundreds of fighters could now muster barely a few dozen. Fuel reserves dwindled, airfields lay cratered, and aircraft production, the pride of Nazi industry, was in ruins. But most damaging of all was what the German command could not replace: its pilots. Each man lost in Big Week was an irreplaceable veteran. Each new recruit who took off the next morning knew the odds, and flew anyway. By the time the last bombers crossed the North Sea back into England, the balance of air power over Europe had shifted. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, and the Allies knew it. Yet Doolittle's men weren't done. Their next target was symbolic, the one city the Germans believed untouchable. Berlin. Berlin, March 6, 1944. The morning of March 6, 1944, was gray and bitterly cold over eastern England. Crews awoke before dawn, shuffling into briefing halls filled with cigarette smoke and tension. The target map at the front of the room bore a single, terrifying word in red: Berlin. Gasps rippled through the room. No American bomber had ever reached the German capital in daylight. The Luftwaffe's command center, flak belts, and fighter defenses were the most formidable on Earth. But this time, the Allies had something new, a weapon that could make the impossible possible. At 8:30 a.m., engines thundered across England. B-17s and B-24s formed up over the channel, climbing into thin blue light. And above them, darting like silver arrows, came the P-51 Mustangs, hundreds of them. The German radar operators near Bremen saw it first. A wave of blips larger than anything they'd ever tracked. Orders flashed across radio networks. Alle Jäger starten. All fighters take off. From airfields at Berg, Wernigerode, and Stendal, the Luftwaffe launched every machine it had. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs clawed into the sky, their pilots grimly aware that this battle would decide the fate of Germany's air war. Over central Germany, the two forces met. Contrails twisted like ribbons across the frozen sky. Explosions bloomed at 25,000 feet. German fighters attacked in desperate waves. Head-on passes through the bomber streams, cannon shells flashing like sparks in a steel storm. But waiting for them were the Mustangs. They dove from the sun, guns blazing. In seconds, formations of Bf-109s shattered. One pilot, Franz Stigler, recalled seeing Mustangs everywhere, above, below, behind, like hawks over a field of crows. Major James H. Howard and his 354th Fighter Group tore through the first wave. Captain William Wisner's squadron broke another. Each Mustang flew with a mix of precision and fury. Trained, disciplined, unstoppable. For the first time, the bombers reached Berlin with their escorts still beside them. It was a moment that defied German belief. Over the capital, American formations dropped thousands of bombs on rail yards, factories, and power stations. The city shook beneath them. On the ground, Berliners looked up through drifting smoke to see tiny silver dots streaking across the sky. It was not just destruction they saw, it was inevitability. Above the chaos, Mustang pilots continued their deadly dance. In less than an hour, over 60 Luftwaffe fighters were destroyed. The rest scattered, low on fuel, pursued all the way to their airfields. When the bombers finally turned west, the Mustangs stayed with them all the way home. For the Luftwaffe, it was a day of reckoning. For the Allies, it was proof that the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The shock rippled through every German airbase. The unthinkable had happened. Berlin had been bombed in daylight, and its defenders could do nothing to stop it. The age of the P-51 Mustang had truly begun. Spring 1944, the fall of the Luftwaffe begins. In the weeks following the first daylight raid on Berlin, the Luftwaffe began to unravel. The numbers told the story better than any headline. Between February and May 1944, Germany lost nearly 2,000 fighters, far more than it could ever replace. Aircraft factories, once humming with production, now lay in ruins. Fuel depots burned. Supply chains broke down. But the true devastation ran deeper. It was human. Veteran pilots, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Many of the new recruits had less than 100 flight hours when they were thrown into combat against elite American and British units. Entire squadrons vanished within days. The Mustangs' dominance made every sortie a gamble. The Luftwaffe could still fight and fight fiercely, but it could no longer win. Over the skies of Germany, the balance of power had shifted permanently. Allied bomber losses dropped sharply. Missions that had once been suicide now became routine. For every fortress that fell, 10 German fighters went down. And still, the bombers came every day in greater numbers. From Kiel to Munich, from the Ruhr to Vienna, the Allied air offensive became relentless. Cities burned. Factories ceased production. Transport networks collapsed under the constant rain of high explosives. For German civilians, the war in the air turned from distant thunder to daily terror. Sirens, firestorms, and endless nights in shelters replaced the propaganda of victory. The promise of Nazi invincibility was dead. By late spring, the Luftwaffe had lost what every air force needs most: the initiative. Its remaining pilots could only react, never dictate. And when they did take off, the Mustangs were waiting. P-51 squadrons began sweeping deep into Germany, strafing airfields, trains, and convoys. They struck at fuel depots, aircraft on the ground, even runways themselves. Now, nowhere was safe. Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring, once the arrogant architect of air supremacy, reportedly watched an American formation flying unopposed over Berlin and said bitterly, "When I saw Mustangs over the capital, I knew the war was lost." The Reich still fought, but its air force was dying in the skies above it. And the Mustang was the instrument of that destruction. Summer 1944, the skies belonged to the Allies. By June 1944, the war in the air had been decided. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Broken, starved of fuel, and bleeding pilots faster than it could bury them. And the P-51 Mustang had become more than just an aircraft. It was the symbol of Allied control, sleek, confident, unstoppable. When the first waves of Allied troops crossed the English Channel on D-Day, they did so under the safest skies of the entire war. German resistance was scattered and desperate. Fighters that did rise were swarmed by Mustangs long before they could reach the beaches. In the weeks that followed, the Allies used their air dominance to choke the German army from above. Columns of tanks, trains, and trucks were obliterated before they could reach the front. Supply depots vanished in firestorms. Bridges and rail lines were cut, isolating entire divisions. Every German move was watched, every counterattack punished. The Luftwaffe tried to strike back, especially with new advanced aircraft like the Me-262 jet. But by then, it was too late. The infrastructure, the pilots, the fuel, everything that made a fighting air force possible was gone. In the months after D-Day, Allied bombers ranged freely across Europe, turning industrial cities into rubble. The air war had achieved what no army could alone: the systematic destruction of Nazi Germany's capacity to fight. The Mustang squadrons became legends: the 4th, 352nd, 357th, 332nd Red Tails, and others. They escorted bombers over the Alps, the Danube, and even into Austria, striking deep into the heart of the Reich. By early 1945, American and British bombers flew missions in daylight with near-total impunity. The Luftwaffe existed in name only. From the cockpit of a Mustang, a pilot could look down and see the war collapsing beneath him. Trains burning, bridges gone, German armor scattered. It was victory made visible from the sky. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, it was not just the Red Army that had conquered it. It was the relentless thunder of Allied air power that had paved the way. The Mustang had done what no Allied fighter before it could. It had taken the fight all the way to the enemy's capital and come home. And in doing so, it had changed the very nature of modern warfare forever. The skies were clear. The war was ending. But the story of the Mustang, and what it revealed about the future of air combat, was only just beginning. Legacy of the P-51 Mustang, the machine that changed the sky. The P-51 Mustang was born not from luck, but from desperation and perfected by innovation. It bridged continents, turned defeat into dominance, and gave wings to victory. Before it, no Allied fighter could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and back again. After it, no one would ever underestimate the power of range, speed, and precision combined. It was the plane that ended isolation in air combat, the first true global fighter. From England's cloudy fields to the heart of Berlin, the Mustang redefined what freedom of the skies meant. But beyond the machine itself, it represented something larger, a turning point in the very idea of warfare. It proved that technology, when driven by necessity and courage, could alter the fate of nations. For the pilots who flew her, the Mustang was more than aluminum and fuel. It was a partner, a lifeline, the difference between life and death. And for the men trapped beneath its shadow, it was the harbinger of a war they could no longer win. By the time peace returned to Europe, the roar of the Mustang had become the sound of liberation, and the silence that followed, its echo. Decades later, When veterans gather and the memories return, they still speak of it with reverence, not just as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of resolve, innovation, and hope. The P-51 Mustang didn't just escort bombers to Berlin. It escorted humanity from the darkness of total war toward a new era of air power, freedom, and endurance. The skies over Europe would never look the same again.